There was a time when sunlight turned the earth into a gallery, when elegant estates welcomed works of art that drew us closer and closer together. It was a captivating time. It was spring, this spring at Biltmore. Plan your visit or overnight stay so you can enjoy the marvelous works of Chihuly while every corner of Biltmore blooms. Reserve now to get spring savings at Biltmore.com.
Welcome back to Working Overtime, the advice-forward horseradish to working's charoset. I'm your host, Isaac Butler.
And if you're puzzling over that reference in mid-May, yes, we're recording this episode during Passover. I'm your other host, June Thomas. Isaac, what are we up to today?
Well, besides dreaming of all the leavened breads I'm going to eat in a few days, I wanted to talk about sticking with it over the long haul on a creative project. Now, you and I feel like we've done a lot of episodes about when to bail on a project,
Yes.
telling people to bail on a project, telling people to physically destroy a project. I don't know about you, but I've stuck an entire finished book in a drawer from which it will never emerge. Knowing when to part ways with something we've worked hard on, obviously very important. But now I want to talk about the other thing, sticking with a project over the long haul, even when you have no idea whether it will ever get done or be put out in the world. Keeping the faith. In other words, June, neither of us work on spec very often. So I'm wondering, do you have a lot of experience with keeping the faith or what?
No, I really don't. I did do a book proposal that didn't sell, but then I put it aside.
You weren't like, maybe I'll turn it into a one-woman show.
No, I was not. And if anything, I'm a little bit too liable to settle at the, this isn't perfect, but it's done point, rather than working on a piece. I would like to kind of get to a point where I feel better about that, but I'm not a keeper of the faith.
Yeah, I'm the same way. And I feel like with both of us, it's like web and magazine publishing has like shaped our brains in
Yes.
such a way that that's like just how we think, right? And I'm always pitching something before I write it. I'm always proposing a book before I write it. But my friend Justin Taylor was in a really different boat. He has this brilliant new novel out called Reboot. I actually loved it so much that I posted about it on Blue Sky, and those posts became a blurb on the back of the book.
Wow.
It is, I'm going to go out on a limb here, maybe the best novel I've ever read that captures how the internet shapes our reality. And
Wow.
what's more, Justin, I happen to know, worked on the novel for a very long time. Despite feeling very up to the moment, the book actually had a quite long gestation process.
Well, I know that fiction tends to be sold after it's written, so I know that isn't completely unheard of, but I am still in absolute awe of people who make that commitment and then stick with it for the long haul.
Well, the good news I have for you, June, is you can now express that awe to Justin Taylor because he is actually here and able to discuss all of this on this week's Working Overtime. Justin, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you guys so much for having me.
Justin, before we talk about your process, could you give our listeners a sense of what your book is about?
Sure. So, Reboot is a novel about a former child actor who, as a teenager, starred on a kind of early aughts teen drama, kind of Buffy the Vampire Slayer by way of Dawson's Creek. And on the eve of its 20th anniversary, as he himself approaches middle age, he's gotten it in his head that he would like to see the show rebooted for its 20th anniversary. And so he's flying around the country trying to get his old castmates to sign on to this with him. This includes his first ex-wife, one of his oldest friends, but also career rivals, and a guy who's since become a right-wing politician in the small town in Florida where they shot the show. So he's got his work cut out for him. And then just to complicate things a little bit farther, everywhere he goes, from Portland to Los Angeles to New York to Florida, the effects of climate collapse are sort of complicating his travel schedule, even as an internet conspiracy theory related to a video game that he did some voice work for threatens to spill over into real world consequences. So that's the book.
Wow.
Amazing. And now the big question, the $6 million question, how long ago did you actually start writing it? Like, when did you get the idea for it?
I started this book on New Year's Day, 2014. I had already sold my second story collection, what would have been my third book, and that was going to come out later in 2014. And I thought, I should really get a second novel going. It's been a few years. And so my dear friend Adam Wilson and I decamped to the Berkshires where his family had a little place. And we decided to spend a week there together writing our magnum opus, as it were. And we both started novels. Then 10 years went by somehow.
And I'm curious, did you have some core idea of the premise of the book starting out, or were you like, I'm just going to go to a beautiful place in the Berkshires and whatever comes out of the hand comes out of the hand?
The core idea was this guy who had been a child actor and a kind of teen celebrity, and looking back on that some years later and kind of reckoning with his life and trying to get this show back together. That was the original idea. So he was there, David, the narrator, Shane, his friend / rival, and Grace, his one-time romantic partner and also part of the show. So the three of them were kind of there from the beginning, but just about everything else changed. One of the first big changes as I started writing was this idea of bringing in the internet and thinking about like things going viral and celebrity culture online and, you know, that sort of thing. And I wrote all these scenes set on Twitter, which I had never used before. And so I joined Twitter in early 2014, really for research.
That's how they get you.
Yeah, that's where the next 10 years went.
Well, I can't wait to hear more about how you navigated all of this after this.
What's the best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day in everyday situations. But if that's not on the cards this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. I've used apps in the past to learn new languages, but when I came across Babbel, I wondered if it could help me refresh my knowledge of a language I once spoke well, but was now a little bit or quite a lot rusty. I have to say, I was impressed. The advanced lessons were really useful, tips and idioms that can help with in-depth conversations on topics that I can actually imagine chatting about. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel is designed by real people for real conversations, and the tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. What's more, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for working listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for working listeners at babbel.com/working. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/working, spelled BABBEL.com/working. Rules and restrictions may apply. Reboot your credit card with Apple Card, the only credit card designed for iPhone. It gives you up to 3% daily cash back on every purchase. Plus, Apple Card has no fees, not even hidden ones. Apply for Apple Card now in the Wallet app on iPhone. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Subject to credit approval. Variable APRs for Apple Card range from 19.24% to 29.49% based on creditworthiness. Rates as of February 1st, 2024. Terms and more at applecard.com. Hey listeners, do you have any tips or questions about the creative process? Get in touch and share your advice. You can email us at working@slate.com, or even better, you can call us and leave a message at 304-933-9675. That's 304-933-WORK.
And we're back. So, Justin, Reboot is not like a super long book. I went and got it off my shelf. It's under 300 pages. We're not talking Underworld. We're not talking Infinite Jest. So the long gestation period is not that you're writing a 1,000-page long epic. Can you talk about some of the challenges, whether they were craft or whatever else that you navigated during the years that you were working on it?
Sure. You know, the book took a very long time, but in certain respects, it actually happened quite quickly. It just failed quickly a lot of times before it worked quickly, I guess.
Like how many times, do you know?
I'm going to say, I mean, really, like, I quit writing this novel at least once a year, every single year that I was working on it. So not to undermine the premise of this too much, but it's less a story of perseverance than a story of, in fact, quitting and rebooting. I just kept going back to it and starting it over. I kind of couldn't leave the idea alone, even as I really couldn't get it right. There were a couple of finished drafts. There were a few abandoned drafts, and they all just collapsed for various reasons. And then every once in a while, after about 6 months after I said I quit, I would just get this urge to go back and do it again.
Do you know what was calling you back? Was it the character, or was it you'd go on Twitter and you'd be like, these fools?
I think some of it was the character. You know, it was a story that I thought would be fun to tell, that I was excited about. And I actually was a child actor. And in my earliest days, I quit the business before this narrator would even have gotten his start. I certainly wasn't on any teen dramas. So there was a little bit of speculative what-ifing there that I think was maybe what had provoked the novel in the first place. You know, if I had stuck with it and then gifting myself the fantasy of incredible success and then the further fantasy of losing it all and trying to gain it back. So I think that was the thing that I was really playing with. But the other thing was, I think once I was interested in this idea of how celebrity interacts with popular culture, which I think happens in a couple of ways. I mean, some of it is the way that virality or ubiquity online creates celebrity, but it's also very interesting to me that the act of being online kind of turns us all into micro celebrities and brand managers and people with public personae in a way that's really historically unprecedented. I just found that fascinating. So every time the novel would fall apart, really for pragmatic reasons, because I couldn't get the point of view right or the jokes weren't funny or whatever, and then I would start it again, more stuff would have happened in that cultural narrative around celebrity and social media. And so it'd be another layer to it, you know? Like certain things I think we thought were very funny in 2014 seemed, say, less funny in 2016 and less funny in 2020. And, you know, and the whole thing just kept mutating.
And of course, one other thing you've got to do during this whole time is make money, you know, because you need to live and eat and all sorts of things like that.
Sure.
Creating the life that affords us the space to do our creative work is like, that's a big topic we talk about here, because that is sort of where a lot of people's creative energy go. In your case, you're an extremely dedicated teacher. You run a low-res MFA program at Sewanee. You've taught many other places besides. How did you work to create that balance? Because you're traveling a lot. You're not at home. You know, are you the type of person who schedules specific time to do your creative work? Or are you more like, oh, I have a couple hours free, I'm just going to sit down and do this?
I'm more of a couple hours free person. Wow. I like it when I can get, you know, if I can steal a day, like an entire day or even a few days, that feels amazing. I love to just disappear into the work and really just live it and breathe it and not know how much time is passing. And that doesn't often happen. I mean, usually you're stealing a couple hours before a class or in a coffee shop or whatever. But you use the word balance. And I guess what I would say is, I don't feel that there was any balance really at any point. It's a life out of balance in every possible way. When I started this novel, I lived in New York City and I was an adjunct professor at a few different schools and had achieved a kind of precarious balance, just in that I was pretty consistently getting work semester on semester and kind of knew what the budget was. And then in 2015, my now wife and I moved across the country and there was no teaching work there, which is how I got in the habit of taking these visiting writer gigs that I was luckily able to get. So I did a semester in Indianapolis. I did a year in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Later, I did a semester in Missoula, Montana. I did a school year in Salem, Oregon, which luckily was close enough to Portland that I could live at home. And each one of those things was very different structurally in terms of the teaching load, in terms of what it paid. And so some of them were really quite luxurious and others were really a kind of glorified grunt work. Somebody had gone on sabbatical and they'd dumped me with his teaching load, probably at half pay, but you just took your title and did it. And then, you know, mixed in with all this was times I was working on Reboot or book criticism or short stories or, you know, this memoir that I ended up writing, which is also part of the reason that Reboot took so long, because I stopped what I was doing for 4 years and wrote this other book.
Yeah, actually, Justin, I want to ask you about that, because we should also say that you were quite a prolific writer during the period that you've been working on Reboot. You've written short stories, features, lots and lots of book reviews. As you said, you also published a memoir, Riding with the Ghost, about the death of your father. How did you switch back and forth? And did you have any tricks for getting back into the headspace of a long gestating project after a break? Because this is different from teaching and writing. This is writing and writing. That feels to me really challenging.
Yeah. No, it's true, and it was. I would say maybe not exactly figuring out how to switch back and forth, but maybe more figuring out that I couldn't. In a lot of the failed drafts of Reboot, particularly in the first several years I was working on, 2014 to 2020, basically, I kept running into this problem where I would write all these characters and I'd get the thing going, and then right around 100 pages, the plot would stop and everyone would have all this backstory about their fathers and their complicated relationship with their fathers. I'm not kidding. I'm dead serious. Just to give you a little bit of a sense, so my father had Parkinson's, among other problems, and he had a long and slow decline, and he and I had a close but complicated relationship that really defined a lot of my 20s and 30s. Even with that said, he passed rather unexpectedly in the spring of 2017, and the memoir ended up kind of coming out of that year of grieving for him, of trying to tell the story of that relationship and the last years of his life and the first year of living without him. And that became that book. And it just sort of emerged as the thing that had to be done. And I didn't even know if I was going to sell it when I was writing it. I just had to do it. And so I was very lucky. I finished it. I sold it. And then it came out in 2020. So, unlucky in the sense that it came out in June of 2020. The pandemic ate it. Nobody saw a galley. I didn't get to tour. It kind of disappeared in publishing terms. But when I went back to Reboot the last time in 2021, none of my characters were complaining about their fathers anymore. And I really mean this. I mean this completely sincerely. It had just cleared the decks so that story wasn't trying to get jammed into the middle of this one.
So you wrote what I guess is now the final version of Reboot in 2021. One of the things I'm always fascinated about when it comes to fiction writers is letting go of characters. Now, when they've been with you for 10 years, how can you possibly let go of them? Was it harder with this particular book because of the long gestation than with other fiction that you've written? Or are you going to tell me, no, they were dead as soon as I hit the last period?
I wouldn't say that they were dead to me, but I would say after 10 years, I was so excited that I had done a version of them that worked, that I had created a version of their story that somebody else could actually see and a world that other people could inhabit, that I was truly excited to get it out of my own hands and into the world. I would say, too, I think my relationship is with maybe the book or the manuscript more than any particular character. That was hard to let go of. Even into the last rounds of edits we were doing, there was always another thing that I wanted to add, another joke that I could tell, another angle to put on something. And that they really did have to kind of pry out of my hands.
Well, we'll be back with more of Keeping the Faith with Justin Taylor after this.
What's the best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day in everyday situations. But if that's not on the cards this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. I've used apps in the past to learn new languages, but when I came across Babbel, I wondered if it could help me refresh my knowledge of a language I once spoke well, but was now a little bit or quite a lot rusty. I have to say, I was impressed. The advanced lessons were really useful, tips and idioms that can help with in-depth conversations on topics that I can actually imagine chatting about. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel is designed by real people for real conversations, and the tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. What's more, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for working listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for working listeners at babbel.com/working. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/working, spelled BABBEL.com/working. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Hey listeners, I just want to remind you that if you are enjoying working overtime, please follow so that you never miss an episode. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, we'd love for you to rate or review the show. It really, really does help new listeners to find us. And if Overcast happens to be your app of choice, please hit the star to recommend the episode to others.
So, Justin, a lot of our listeners struggle with this thing of when to abandon a creative project, in part because of sunk cost fallacy, or as Macbeth puts it, I am in blood, steeped in so far that should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as go o'er. What advice do you have for people who are reaching this point where they're like, do I just light this thing on fire? Do I stick with it? Do I stick it in a drawer? Those kind of inflection points of the long gestation process.
Yeah. I would say I have two pieces of advice, one philosophical and the other pragmatic. I would say philosophically, you can trust that urge. If you're banging your head against something and you're not making any progress, if it no longer feels like problem solving or bushwhacking, it just feels like crashing a car into a wall, stop. There's no shame in it. And I'm here to tell you, stopping, even quitting, doesn't mean quitting forever. I abandoned this book so many times. There's a passage in my memoir about my decision to abandon it forever. And then I went and did it again. And I think part of the reason I was finally able to finish it, besides what I just said about the father thing, is that all the accumulated experience of doing it wrong or failing to satisfy myself or giving up was eventually brought to bear on the draft that I finished. There was just kind of no other way left to do it than to do it this way. And so I did. And that doesn't mean that I think my book is so great or whatever, but it is complete. Whether you love it or you hate it, I wrote it, it's done. And that was not something I could have said about any of the other versions. The other thing I'll say on the pragmatic side is when I decided to do this one last time in 2021, we were still pretty locked down. And so I knew I had the time. I said, I can be in this all day, every day if I want to. And that's what I did. I wrote it longhand over about a month. And then I transcribed it. And that's the book you're reading, give or take some copy edits. When I did that, the rule I made was that I was not allowed to look at any of the last 9 years worth of accumulated manuscripts. Start from where I'd left off, didn't copy paste a draft, a sentence, any of it. And I just thought, if you're going back to the idea is what's good. But the sunk cost thing is not a fallacy. There was so much wasted energy and bad feelings dragging down the manuscripts that I had that already existed that I needed a hard reboot as much as these people in the book that I'm writing did. That too was kind of the most liberating thing, that I wasn't accountable to myself even at that point.
I'm reminded of when I was in graduate school, I interviewed Percival Everett. So this was, I guess, 2012, basically. And he told me, and I don't know if this is still true, that, he's a very prolific author. He writes like a book a year. And the way he does it is he writes the first draft longhand to quote unquote figure the book out. And then he literally throws it in the garbage.
Oh.
And starts over again. So there is something to be said sometimes for not keeping your old drafts.
Justin, one of the things I am fascinated about by Reboot is that you are dealing with the internet. And the internet, as we know, as you've already mentioned, is this constantly changing, endlessly morphing thing. How did you deal with that and find a way to pin something down as elusive as the way we live now? I mean, it really is the air we breathe in some ways, but it is also a different kind of type of oxygen than it was 2 years ago. How did you pin that down?
At first, I didn't know how, and I tried it a lot of different ways. What I finally settled on was setting the frame of the story, that the answer to the limitlessness and chaos, not just of the internet or social media, but of the world. Wordsworth complains about this in The World Is Too Much With Us. I mean, it's not a new feeling, even though it kind of looks different, is I just found ways to set parameters and restrictions. One of the reasons this book is narrated in the first person, I tried it many times in multiple third, almost going for some kind of underworldy thing, and it just didn't work. And it needed an organizing intelligence, which is this voice. And it also needed to know when it was set in time. And so there's really two time limits that allowed the book to get written. One is the 20 years between when the show was on and when they're trying to reboot it. Mm-hmm. And that defined what eras of culture these people all existed in, when they were born, when they'd grown up, what real cultural detritus their fake show had existed among. And it also set the book very firmly in the narrative present. And so once all those decisions were made, I basically set it in September of 2021. That was what I settled on, because I figured that was when they would have to get the idea to make a show that would be shot in 22 and then released in 23 for the 20th anniversary of something that had premiered in summer of 2023. And those decisions dictated every single other thing. They were teenagers on the show, so they had to be in their late 30s in the narrative present, which meant, these were the shows that were on before them. This was on at the same time as them. And also, this is what the internet looked like at this particular moment. And I think I really lucked out in a certain way. Virality and social media seemed, I would say, pretty silly, in the mid-2010s in a way that they really stopped being after the 2016 election, I think, and, the years of kind of litigating misinformation and this and that. And then after 2020, it's the internet's role in kind of pandemic stuff. And then, frankly, after January 6th, I think was another kind of real milestone. And I was very lucky to have seen all that happen and then to just hit a stop point. That's where the book starts. Lockdown has just ended for him. He's been very lonely. And a lot of what's driving him is he wants to go see these people and do this thing because he's been very bored. He doesn't talk much about January 6th, but there's a lot of post-Trump, kind of early Elon's Twitter, that new iteration of dread and conspiracy. And that's just what it is. And, if it had been said a year later, a year earlier, I think it would have been very different.
Well, Justin, as you know, I just love this book. It's very funny. It's very profound. It's beautifully written. It's racking up raves in the Washington Post and the New York Times and Book Forum and other places that are all well-deserved. I'm just so grateful to you that you stuck with it and you brought this story into the world. And thank you so much for talking to us about it today.
Thank you guys so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
I want to give some special thanks to Justin for coming on to share his experience with us, to the Working Overtime producer, Kevin Bendis, and of course, to our series producer, Cameron Drews. We'll be back with another episode of Working Overtime in 2 weeks and a regular episode of Working on Sunday. Until then, get back to work.